Good evening and welcome. I'm Leif Winar, the faculty director of the McCoy Center for Ethics, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first event of the year. The mission of the McCoy Center is to bring ethical reflection to society's most pressing issues, and we are extremely fortunate tonight to have Donovan X. Ramsey and Vaughn Raspberry with us to discuss Donovan's new book, When Crack Was King, A People's History of a Misunderstood Era. You've likely heard of Donovan's book already from the rave reviews in the New York Times and the Washington Post, on NPR, many other media sources. You might not know that Donovan was on campus in 2021 as part of the McCoy Center's manuscript workshop initiative. We had a full day of intense discussions at the center on that day 2 years ago, through which Donovan was unfailingly generous and insightful as always. And here we are just 2 years later, welcoming Donovan back to campus with his book on the long list for the National Book Award for Nonfiction. Donovan Ramsey grew up in Columbus, Ohio, coincidentally not far from the school I was bused to as a kid, in an inner city neighborhood that was already tough before crack hit it. Donovan went on to graduate from Morehouse College and then to Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and he has held a variety of prestigious positions in media organizations, most recently being senior reporter for the major newspaper of the city where he now lives, the Los Angeles Times. Donovan will be in conversation tonight with Vaughn Raspberry, an associate professor of English here at Stanford and a longtime friend of the McCoy Center. Vaughn is a graduate of Howard and the University of Chicago and the author of the prize-winning book, Race in the Totalitarian Century, World War and the Geopolitics of African American Culture, as well as many other articles on major Black intellectuals, global Cold War culture, the European Enlightenment, and post-colonial theory. So Donovan will start us off tonight with a short video and a song, followed by the conversation with Vaughn, and then a brief reading from the book, after which we'll open up for a discussion amongst all of us of topics arising from the book and the conversation that follows. So also with great thanks to the Humanities Center for providing this wonderful, lovely venue, please join me in welcoming Donovan X. Ramsey back to Stanford.
Our most serious problem today is cocaine. Who's responsible? Let me tell you straight out. Everyone who uses drugs.
Say no to drugs and say yes to life.
Crack comes in a vial like this.
You're caught with that, you go to jail for 5 years.
Crack can cost you your family, your friends, your job. Habitual cocaine users, especially crack users, are the most pressing immediate drug problem.
Make no mistake, drug abuse is the new slavery.
Crime bill, the Biden crime bill.
The Biden crime bill.
Hell, we've got crime bills coming out our ears.
So play it smart. Don't fall out with drugs.
Yeah, that's the way to say it.
This is crack.
It's like putting a gun in your mouth and pulling the trigger.
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
Hit them and hit them hard.
Times like these, people want to get high. Real high and real fast. And this is going to do it. And make us rich.
It's like you smoking it, but you're not. You addicted to the money.
I'm trying to get paid, you understand? And I don't need you butting into my affairs.
Foreclose that.
I mean, for the first time in my life, I see black women abandoning their children.
Parents got to have the control. If the parents don't have the control, the kids gonna run. It starts from home.
Somebody wants to lock me up for 15 years. What chance am I gonna have?
It's easily accessible. It's freedom. It's forgetfulness. The white man can't mess with you while you're here, you high, you heavy.
It's the most addicting thing that
probably ever existed in the world.
And people really don't make us feel good, and we really don't feel a part of the system.
Work hard and you don't get nothing.
You ought to be at the source of these crimes.
Crack is the boss.
To put it broader than that, we're talking about a generation destroyed.
Only you knew how much I do need you. I dream of moments we share, but you're not there. I'm living in a fantasy, 'cause you don't even suspect, could probably care less about the changes I've been going through. If only you knew how much I do love you.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. So, Donovan, where do I begin? So I was fortunate to read a draft of your book in the workshop that Leif mentioned a few years ago. So it's a wonderful experience for me to be able to read the published version now. And from what I can tell, much of it remains the same. I'm sure there are a lot of differences that I'm unable to see. But there's a beautiful introduction that was entirely new to me. Now, we showed everyone this clip, so I'm sure people would love to hear you reflect on it. But I, at a sort of last minute change, asked if we could play this song by Patti LaBelle, If Only You Knew, because I was so struck by a passage in the introduction that refers to Patti LaBelle's song, and I just felt like everyone needs to hear it. So in your introduction, you write about Michelle, your neighbor from Columbus, Ohio. She was addicted to crack and was the subject of much neighborhood gossip. And you write, quote, "I still can't hear Patti LaBelle sing without thinking of Michelle. She'd blast LaBelle's If Only You Knew so loud each night that the muffled sound of the singer's voice would come through my bedroom windows. 'Cause you don't even suspect, could probably care less about the changes I've been going through," Patti sings with a tear in her voice. If only you knew. It's heartbreaking for reasons I could never explain. Those are your words. And the end of the quote. Now, I grew up listening to this song. I know it very well, but after reading this passage of the book, it means something entirely different to me. And it also, I think, crystallizes much of what your book is about. So this song it's actually a love song. You know, Patti is singing about an estranged lover who she still loves and who she hopes maybe still loves her in return. But now I have the image indelibly planted in my mind of your neighbor Michelle blaring this song late at night for anyone who will listen. So the song in my mind now is a plea, you know, a tragic, urgent, heartbreaking plea for help, or if not for help, for somebody who gives a damn about what is going on in her house and the changes that she is going through. So I can't get the song out of my head. And it haunts me. So I'm dwelling on this passage because I think it epitomizes what this book, what your book accomplishes so majestically. It pierces through that horrible epithet, crackhead. And you heard it growing up, I heard it growing up. It was the worst thing you could call somebody back in the day. But you pierce through this epithet to expose the real lives and the histories and the gorgeous humanity of the individuals who suffered through this era. And really that's what stands out to me in your book. When I think about the sensitive and absorbing portrayal of your cast of characters, Elgin, Lenny, Kurt Schmoke, Sean. So I imagine it must have been very challenging to write honestly and expansively and in great detail about their lives while also protecting them, in some meaningful sense. So can you, launch our conversation just by walking us through your process and the what it meant to you, what it means to you now to represent these figures' lives, the responsibility you felt for them, and in a difficult subject, if that question makes sense. I'm sorry if it was long-winded, but I felt we had to go through Patty to get to that basic question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question, and also for reminding me of that song. Hey y'all, I wrote When Crack Was King because I was a kid that grew up in a neighborhood that was hard hit by the crack epidemic, and I was lucky enough to be sheltered from the worst of it by my mom who raised my sisters and I by herself. But even with all the sheltering that she did, the neighborhood pierced through. Hearing my mom on the house phone complaining about our neighbor Michelle from down the street, or complaining about, the boys on the corner and wondering, about the safety, right, of us in this neighborhood. And, I was filled with a lot of questions about what was going on in my neighborhood, and those questions never really left me, even after I left Columbus and went to, college and then to graduate school. And, it is Michelle from down the street that inspired me to write this book, to answer the questions about exactly what it was that she was going through, what my neighborhood was like before the crack epidemic, exactly what the crack epidemic was and what its scale was, also what it wasn't. So, that's what the book is about. And to answer your question, it was very difficult to write. It took me 5 years to report and to write the book because it was so sensitive, and it was hard to find people that would talk to me, and then it was hard to get through a full reporting process and interviewing with them, and then it was hard to sit down and to piece it all together. But I tried to put together a book that honored their experiences, that also answered, of course, the questions that I had, and that at the end of the day that I was happy with and that they were happy with. They all are happy with it. So, those were the first people to read the book, and their stamp of approval was the thing that I wanted the most.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your process and your experience with us. And since we started with a video clip and then a song, I'm wondering if, you referred to numerous songs and artists throughout the book. Is there a soundtrack to When Crack Was King? Were there songs that guided you through the process, songs that maybe are important historically because they capture the era, or because you just remember them from your childhood, or because they speak in an eloquent or unique way to that moment, or just songs that help you kind of get through the writing process?
No, there's definitely a playlist that exists on Spotify. It's called When Crack Was King. I made it, and I would listen to that over and over again. It's a mix of a few different songs, but Patty's on there. There's also a great song by McFadden and Whitehead called "Ain't No Stopping Us Now," that I think so beautifully symbolizes the pre-crack era. It is Black America in the late 70s, early 80s, and all of the hope of that period that was really kind of dashed by crack. But there's also a really strong litany of, I would call, anti-crack hip-hop songs that go back as far as Jane, Stop This Crazy Thing by MC Shan, so that's on the list. Night of the Living Bassheads by Public Enemy. Dope Man by NWA. There is a story about the crack epidemic that hip-hop was telling that now if you look at it, it's very clear, it's very consistent. So a lot of those songs are on the playlist. But also, that short video that we showed is there because there was so much media that was created about crack. And I, through the process of putting the book together, I was just collecting all of these clips of PSAs and movies and news reports that I had seen, and those are some of the clips that I presented. But the story that was told through those PSAs and through the news reports was quite different from what I uncovered with the book.
Great, thank you. So this book is very deeply researched in several areas: medical history, government, public policy, cultural history, and not to mention the individual subjects you capture so eloquently. What was the most surprising historical finding from your book? And I'll tell you mine. So your anecdote about Jimmy's World really struck. I don't know, maybe I heard something about it once upon a time, but it took reading your book for me to understand what happened. So Jimmy's World was a Pulitzer Prize winning story about an 8-year-old third generation heroin addict from Washington, D.C. And it was a sensation, I think it's fair to say, catapulted the author into national visibility. It captured the attention of various public figures, including Nancy Reagan, then Washington, D.C. Mayor Marion Barry, who then sought to identify, locate Jimmy and to try to save him. But the problem was Jimmy did not exist. He was a fictional creation and entirely made up. And that, I'm not sure I ever knew that. I kind of remember the story from my childhood, but not ever learning that Jimmy was made up. And this is just one of the jewels throughout the book of kind of historical anecdotes that cumulatively, I think, correct our popular understanding of this era. And I think it's why you subtitle your book A People's History of a Misunderstood Era, because you're correcting the record and a lot of the misconceptions that circulated at that time, but also even, I think, into the present. And I like that anecdote because, it seems to capture or distill so many different themes, that pertain to the representation of Black urban life or the Black poor. This sort of tendency toward prurient or voyeuristic voyeurism in Black communities, or sensationalized accounts of Black pathology, or also the financial incentive for journalists and writers to falsify Black life. And then finally, also I think a kind of missionary ethos that seeks to save poor and damaged Black people rather than ameliorate the conditions that give rise to suffering in the first place. So that anecdote is particularly poignant, and it's maybe one of my favorites. What is one of your favorite historical findings in the course of your research?
First, I love the Jimmy's World story because as a journalist, it gets at a lot of the misinformation that I was trying to sort through when it came to putting together the book. The book and sort of the story of crack, I started in 1965, so it goes back to the pre-crack era, and it kind of establishes how cities were vulnerable to the crack epidemic, but also how the media was vulnerable to the propaganda that later came out about crack. And the Jimmy's World story is so interesting because not only was it a big story, it unraveled because the woman that wrote it, Janet Cook, won a Pulitzer Prize for the story. So she became the first black woman to ever win a Pulitzer for news reporting. And also she's still today the only person to ever give a Pulitzer Prize back. But the only reason that it was discovered is because she won a Pulitzer. So this complete fabrication, one, came out of her imagination. It went past a series of editors, including Bob Woodward, who was executive editor of the Washington Post at the time. It was put on the cover of the Washington Post with illustrations because there were no photos. So all the red flags are going off that this story is made up. But they liked the story so much. This story of a 9-year-old heroin addict who you said was a third-generation heroin addict, who was the product of an incestuous relationship between his mother and grandfather. I mean, it was every awful thing that you could think of in this one story. So they liked it enough to put it on the cover of the paper and to give it a Pulitzer. And I think that sort of sets the stage for the kind of villainization of cities, of black communities, of young people that you would see during the crack era. So Jimmy's World is fascinating for that reason. The piece of unknown history that I came across that I really think about a lot is actually the genesis of crack, which is through all of the interviewing that I did. I visited in 2018 the 10 hardest hit cities, and I tried to, in my conversations with users and dealers, find out where their first interaction was with crack as a substance. And we traced it back here to the Bay Area. And that was very surprising for me that I got to a handful of dealers in LA, including Freeway Ricky Ross, who said that he learned how the process of making crack from an LA pimp who had connections and family in the Berkeley area. And that he said he had learned it from a group of Berkeley students, chemistry students, and that he had learned it by its original name, which was Freebase. So anybody that's old enough to remember the crack era knows that its original name was Freebase before it was called crack. And that term comes from a chemistry term, which is to separate the base of a compound from its other elements. So the people who created crack, who popularized it, had chemistry knowledge, so that actually maps on to the sort of oral history. But then I was able to also find a book that was published in about '78 called The Pleasures of Cocaine by a small Bay Area imprint. It was sold in head shops. That's places where bongs and rolling papers are sold. It's like a small print. They only did books about drugs, and they printed up a bunch of these books and sold them to students in the area, and it included within it recipes for making freebase cocaine, both the traditional way with ether, which is super volatile and created lots of explosions, but then also with baking soda, which is what crack became, this very easy way of making smokable cocaine out of powder cocaine. So we have the Bay Area to thank for crack. Yeah. And college students.
Yeah. So in the video clip that you showed us, I mean, we saw images of public figures in the federal government and beyond, including Joe Biden. Would you first maybe say a word about the Reagan administration's role in crafting anti-crack policy, and then also Biden's role a little bit later in creating mass incarceration as a response to the crack epidemic?
So When Crack Was King is in many ways a book about storytelling. So it's, you know, my effort to piece together a history that feels real out of the stories of the folks that I interviewed, but also to sort through all the stories that got told, some that were, you know, accurate and some weren't. The Reagans were, I would say, the chief architects of a lot of misinformation during the crack era. So, you know, they inherited, and I say they because Nancy and Ronald Reagan worked really in tandem around crack, but they inherited the war on drugs from Nixon, that they brought the war on drugs that Nixon launched during his administration back. And instead of targeting heroin and weed at the time, they targeted marijuana and cocaine in the form of crack. And their approach was twofold. The first was headed up by Nancy Reagan in the Just Say No campaign. So she responded very vocally to that Jimmy's World story and said, you know, that this drug issue is big in America and I want to take it on. And then this is before 87. In 87, Len Bias dies, a basketball player for the University of Maryland who was drafted to the Boston Celtics. And the night of that draft, he dies of a cocaine overdose. And this then kicks the war on drugs into high gear. The Reagan administration creates this messaging campaign, Just Say No, that is about targeting young people and protecting young people. So Nancy Reagan is appearing on Different Strokes, and also visiting schools around the country to tell kids just say no. The administration is also reaching out to their contacts in Hollywood, getting the executives of major networks to donate airtime for PSAs, which is major, right, to give up free airtime for an effort like that. And at the same time, giving billions of dollars to the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, which is a nonprofit made up of ad executives who then created memorable commercials like This Is Your Brain on Drugs. I like that ad because at the end of the ad, they ask any questions. And of course, you have a million questions, right? Like, it's just an egg in a pan. Like, I want to know what crack is, right? Like, I want to know, like, you know, is like crack really killing people? Like, I have questions about what happened to my neighbor, and you're just saying, this is your brain on drugs, and just say no, you know? So that is on one hand, and that's being headed up by Nancy Reagan in a sort of forward-facing way. But then the Reagan administration, on the other end, is actually enacting a ton of draconian policies and putting out, crime bills all throughout the Reagan administration. People know about the '94 crime bill under Bill Clinton, but Ronald Reagan put out 2 crime bills. George Bush put forward a crime bill. You know that it was a bipartisan effort to really create the system that we have now. So we get, for example, the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, not from the Bill Clinton '94 crime bill, but from a Reagan crime bill.
Great, thank you. So we haven't spoken very much yet about the 4 characters, the 4 people at the heart of this story. I'm not sure what question I have in mind, but can you give us a glimpse of what it was like getting to know, these people, or maybe whose story was the most challenging to write? Were there some barriers to communication. I imagine it took a while to develop a rapport with them. What was that process like, and what was it like getting to know these individual stories that are, that are harrowing, frankly, some more so than others, but these are difficult stories, I'm sure, for them to share, and also difficult for you to write. What was that process like? This is, again, it's a people's history, right? We're not, and what is really remarkable about this book is that it does, I understand by a people's history, your intention to capture the lives of ordinary people rather than, say, policy elites and government figures and so on. You managed to do both, right? But really the heart and soul of the book involves these four people. So just share with us a little bit about them, or one, any kind of relationship or anything that I think would be, interesting for everyone here to learn.
I love the four characters. So it's Lenny Woodley, who's from South Central LA, Kurt Schmoke, who's from Baltimore. He was the mayor of Baltimore, the first elected black mayor. Elgin Swift, who's from Yonkers, New York, and Sean McCrae, who's from Newark. And I knew from the beginning, from the proposal stage, that I wanted to include narratives in the book, that it couldn't just be a history of the crack epidemic that told crack's story without talking about the ways that it actually impacted people. And I wanted to give as much time and space to those personal narratives as I did to the sort of meta history. Because for me, it's like that's what's always missing from history books. You learn about events and dates, but you hardly ever hear about how people's lives are impacted by those events. So in 2018, I traveled for a whole year across the country to cities that were hard hit by crack, and met people, hundreds of people whose lives had been touched. And as you can imagine, it was difficult to ask people basically about like the worst things that ever happened to them. You're saying, you're opening up, like, tell me about how crack impacted your life. And I think that I was able to do it because of my personal experience in growing up and my real curiosity about folks that I see as my neighbors and as my community. So I think that maybe people didn't feel as though it was a outside looking in project, but we were kind of telling each other stories and building understanding together. The hardest things, I think, were trying not to re-traumatize people. So, to write a book like this, you have to ask a question like, why did you smoke crack? What was so great about crack that you smoked crack for 30 years? And you don't want to ask an addict what was great about your drug of choice, So you find ways of getting around that, asking people close to them, how did they act, or, asking dealers, what people told them about their experiences. Afterwards, I have to say it was easy for me to listen to them because I like listening to people and talking to people. It was harder to write it. And I had always sort of prided myself on being able to process information in my journalism and not feel like I was taking it on. But this book, it took a lot out of me. It took a lot out of me to write it. And I feel like that the process of making sense of what I learned was an emotional undertaking as well.
Thank you for sharing both their stories, but also your process with us. And I think your remarks are particularly useful and insightful for many of us. I know we have some students, also faculty in the audience. Many of us are writing about people's lives and always wrestling with the implications of how we represent those lives. can we do it accurately, truthfully, while also maintaining some kind of professional standards, protocols, and so forth, but also in a way that retains some fidelity to these people. You know, that we're not just extracting information or stories from them. You know, we have to do so in a responsible way while also trying to produce a narrative, an ethnography, an account that has its own structure. So I think that what you have to say on this score is really insightful for those of us who are involved in similar work. But my next question has to do more with, I think, the horizon we face now in a so-called, post-crack era. It is no longer an epidemic, even though people may still use it. But you document for us the aftermath of this recent past, and it is a recent past. So from the standpoint of politics and just social responsibility, like what do we as a society, as a culture owe, those who have been victimized by the crack era? And I think you demonstrate, just both individual users, communities, but also the kinds of forces that have impinged on these communities from the government and elsewhere. There was kind of harm upon harm inflicted by this epidemic. So what do we owe them,
I would say that I wrote this book because we're still dealing with the residue of the crack epidemic. So, I've covered criminal justice issues my entire career and have always been frustrated by the lack of progress around, policies that just don't make any sense, like let's say stop and frisk in cities around the country, which is, been deemed unconstitutional in places like New York, and it is on its face, but we have it in many places and always wondered why. Well, stop and frisk is a crack era policy that the intention is to find drugs or weapons on people. Mandatory minimum sentences. The thing that we feed people into the criminal justice system and then we hold them there, and that we don't have a release valve because of these mandatory minimum sentences that takes discretion away from judges. It says that, lawmakers know best about how long a person should be in prison. That frustrates me. The fact that exists and we can have conversations about trying to eliminate laws like that, but we won't really make much progress until we understand why we introduced them in the first place. We also live in a society where there is an ongoing drug epidemic in the form of opioids. And again, the system is frustrated about, what to do with this problem. And I think that we didn't learn the lessons of the crack epidemic, and that we continue to be vulnerable to substances because we imagine that there was nothing to learn from what happened to this group of marginalized people. So now it's happening to another group of marginalized people. So I wrote this book because I want to, at least what I discovered, right, is that human beings have a very difficult relationship to substances, and that in a society like ours, when we create so much devastation in the lives of whole communities, that things like drug epidemics happen, that that the crack epidemic happened because there was so much disaffection and devastation in urban centers and in Black and Latino communities especially, that people were looking for something to feel good. And they also were looking for ways to make money. And crack provided both of those things. I mean, it's a substance tailor-made, right? Like cocaine makes people euphoric. So that's why they used it. And it was a way to get rich that young men at that time would have, never had that opportunity, mostly young men, to have. People are also devastated now in many communities, that they feel hopeless, and they're also looking for ways to make money. And as long as we have conditions like that, we will always have, that there can always be a substance, right, that can be made cheap and easily accessible, that can then create a much larger problem. What we owe folks that survived the crack epidemic is to get right, to actually create a system, one that has things like harm reduction, that keeps people alive long enough for people to get clean, but that also gives people ways of entering treatment. While I was writing the book, when I, first started the first draft, I was still living in New York, in Crown Heights, and I had a neighbor who obviously had an issue with opioids. He was an older man, and he would just be nodding off on the street. And I realized then that with everything that I know about the criminal justice system, with everything that I was learning about drug treatment, that there was nothing that I could do for him besides call the police, which I was not going to do. And it's a shame that so many people have suffered throughout this country's history with substance abuse, and that we haven't figured out something better.
That's a really excellent point. And I think we're in the interest of time, I'll just pose one more question. And I think one of the key and most important findings of your study is that, it was really young people who led to the end of the crack era. In other words, it was not the war on drugs, it was not mass incarceration, it was not stop and frisk or any of these top-down initiatives that had even worse effects or that compounded the crisis. But it was a kind of a cultural shift that I think you also show, like hip hop was really instrumental in, and maybe black popular culture more generally. But really, young people kind of turned the tide. Did you kind of know that all along, and just found the evidence to substantiate it, or was that something you learned in the course of your research? And then I guess my follow-up question would be, does that insight bear on any of the huge array of problems that we face in in the 21st century? Yeah, I think I knew on some level that there was this pop culture component to what ended the crack epidemic, and I knew that young people like me made different decisions. I remember going to college and being around folks that hadn't witnessed the devastation that I did growing up, doing cocaine at parties and in bathrooms, and me being like, oh, y'all are doing drugs, because I had been so traumatized, right, by like what I saw. And when I, did the digging into trying to measure and map cocaine's rise and fall, I came across this incredible series of studies done by the Department of Justice that showed that it wasn't Nancy Reagan, it wasn't policing, because of course when you lock up one drug dealer, another one, fills the place. And that actually creates a lot more street level violence because you destabilize drug markets and people then fight for supremacy, within drug markets, but that's another story. And that it was, that drug epidemics are like any trend. So something becomes popular with a cohort of people. And that was, with crack, people who were about 18 to 25 in about 1980
85 to 1990. In some cities, a little bit earlier. In that, in order for the drug epidemic to continue, not only do those people have to stay addicted to crack, but the next cohort of young people have to take it up as well. And it was the next generation of young people who saw the devastation around them and they said, no, thank you, I'm good. And that's what the research showed, right? That they went out and they did not just quantitative research, but there was a series of ethnographies that talked to young people about what it was, and they said it was seeing their neighbors, people like my Michelle from down the street, that turned them away from hard drugs. And I should say that for a long time there was sort of this protective buffer where Black and Latino youth not only don't do cocaine at the rates of their white counterparts, but any hard drugs at the rates of their white counterparts. Because of this experience with crack, that's starting to go away, sadly, that sort of protective layer. But trying to think of your question. Yes, that was surprising for me. Something that I thought was really interesting that I had not expected was that people talked about hip hop and the messaging of rap music, actually listening to songs like Night of the Living Bassheads, Everyday Struggle by the Notorious B.I.G., that it was sort of it was reinforcing what they saw in their neighborhoods, that it was terrible to be a drug dealer, that it was terrible to be a drug addict, and that, the movies of the time, whether it's Pookie in New Jack City, played by Chris Rock, or, movies like Menace to Society or Boys in the Hood by Black filmmakers, were talking about that lifestyle and painting, I think, a more nuanced picture. The last thing that I'll say is that, very interestingly, when you look at the rise and fall of crack, that crack sort of starts to taper off in the early 90s, dropping completely off crack use for young Black and Latino people in 1992. And during that same year, marijuana use skyrockets. So the researchers think that instead of making cocaine a first drug of choice for experimentation, that many people decided to just use weed. And 1992 happens to be the year that Dr. Dre dropped The Chronic. So I think, that there was a lot of messaging about how terrible rap music was at glamorizing drugs. And there was a lot of bad messaging in the music at the time, but it could be that in The Chronic, Dr. Dre gave us an alternative for what it is that we could actually, for, a substance that's actually legal in California now. So.
Well, it's a beautiful and riveting book, and it's just such a pleasure to discuss it with you. I think now's the perfect time to turn it over to our audience and give you an opportunity to ask questions.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy, please. Okay, we do have mics there. Thank you.
Okay. Right down here.
Oh, thank you. Don't be shy. Yeah, I want to know what you think about FX's Snowflake and how that dovetails with what you found in your research at Snowfall and how that, thank you. My wife got me there. Yeah. Thanks, baby. Snowfall, and how that dovetails with the research that you did and saw, and how they come together, or do they?
It's a great question. So Snowfall, it was announced that John Singleton was making that just as right after I sold the book. So I was like, oh God, John Singleton's about to outdo me and I won't be able to do anything. So I avoided Snowfall entirely because I didn't want to be impacted by it. But I'm just now starting to watch the show. And it seems to be really good. I think that from what I've seen, it is loosely based on Freeway Ricky Ross's life story. So a Los Angeles area drug dealer who basically popularized crack in LA, and then it spread to to other cities. But it seems to skew pretty closely to Rick Ross's lived experience. So I think that is a good story to tell. And since John Singleton has passed, it's been I think kept up by some really good writers. So I look forward to watching the rest of it.
It does highlight this Berkeley-Oakland connection.
Oh, it does? It does. Okay. Okay, so they got it right.
So, what do you think? I know it's really easy to like look at things from hindsight, but I find myself always looking back to the AIDS epidemic, which happened in a similar time period, had similar problems with administration, and then now the current COVID epidemic, and how the lessons that should have been learned weren't learned in terms of response. What do you think could have made the difference in preventing this continued state-sanctioned violence against Black and Brown Americans that continues to say? What do you think could have made the difference during the height of the epidemic?
That's a really good question. Thank you for that. I think that the federal government was actually very slow to learn about the crack epidemic, and also the news media was, that hip hop, for example, Jane Stop This Crazy Thing is 1983. So as early as 1983, there were rappers rapping about freebase. And you don't start to see policies coming from at least the federal government until 85 and then 87. So I think that the response was slow. Also, I think that the policy should have been what's called interdiction, which is to stop the flow of the substance into the United States. That the Reagans made a very clear effort, and subsequent administrations, to target drug users. And in the messaging, they talked about, who is the enemy here? Anyone that uses crack. So what then you saw was this criminalization of addiction, of poverty, of just living near places where crack was sold. When I think about the sort of devastation that crack had in my neighborhood, I think about the addiction, I think about the violence among dealers, but also I think about the layer of policing then that all of us had to go through. It was this dragnet that was cast across the neighborhood. I kind of wish that they had been trying to find out where the coca plants were actually grown, and not targeting, the hands that they, that the rock form ended up in. I think that would have gone a lot further to creating what they wanted, which was a drug-free America, which would never happen, than just sort of like further traumatizing people, which I think actually kept people in cycles of addiction. Smarter, more targeted policies like interdiction, I think, would have gone a long way. But also support for harm reduction. So when I think about what helped Black and Latino folks especially survive the crack epidemic, when all we were being offered was criminalization, it was grandmothers taking in grandchildren to keep them out of the system, churches doing, getting guns off the streets, more militant groups shutting down crack houses, in some cases burning down crack houses, community patrols, that these were efforts that kept us alive. And that's what I think of harm reduction as. And it's still controversial, the idea that you might give an addict anything other than tough love. But people just need to be kept alive long enough to make another decision. Maybe they don't make it today, but maybe today they also don't die. Like for me, that would be the win. So I wish that we had pursued both harm reduction and interdiction. Yeah. Any questions about crack? Back here.
I'm interested about the connection between art and harm reduction that you've been talking about, especially in music. I was wondering if you saw in your research anything about other types of art that influenced, minority communities in a good way. For example, graffiti or kind of other street art that could have been seen by these communities.
Yeah. Well, there was a really famous series of pieces that were done by Keith Haring in New York. He did a series of huge Crack is Whack murals. And I think that he was responding to, New York being one of the hardest hit cities. So he's someone, I think, on the sort of like street art side that really told that story. But for me, growing up in Columbus, it was all music, it was all film and TV. And a film that I saw as a kid, I don't know why I was seeing this, but it was Spike Lee's Jungle Fever. It's a really good movie. And there is a portrayal of a crack addict by Samuel L. Jackson, who actually had experience with addiction. He plays a character named Gator. And yeah, Gator was something else. And there's a really heartbreaking scene where he steals his mother's television, played by Ruby Dee. And you're able to see in that something that Nancy Reagan in those PSAs, right, that fried egg could never do. That I didn't want to use crack because I didn't want to break my mom's heart in the way Gator broke his mom's heart when he stole her color TV. So, I think that there is a lot that can be done, with art. Yeah. Alexandros Hofanides.
Hello, Mr. Ramsey. It's great to have your book in my hands.
Alex is a good friend of mine, y'all.
So the question I wanted to ask when reading the book, one of the themes that kind of like emerges for me as I read it is love, like between folks, between family members, community members. How did that come up in your conversations with folks?
Yeah. Love came up in really every conversation that I had around this subject matter. People talked about the love loss that pushed them to addiction, either love for community, for individuals that they lost during this period that was really hard for a lot of. The 80s were hard, I learned, right? That, you had a level of like deindustrialization where people lost jobs, they lost homes, a feeling of safety, of promise from what the civil rights movement was supposed to produce for Black folks in America. And then when crack came in, people lost their communities that they loved. And then people then lost family members and folks that they grew up with. But then also it was love that pulled people towards recovery. Lenny Woodley, who's a woman that I profile in the book, was addicted to crack for decades, and she tried to enter recovery a number of times. And it was first for her son. She had a son through her addiction that she wanted to get clean for, but ultimately she had to regain some idea of herself and sort of this love for herself that she was born with and cultivated before her addiction. And she wanted to get back to that. I think it's really important that we remember that even during periods that are as trying and as scary as the crack epidemic, that there's still so much love happening. Yeah. So thank you for that.
I have so many questions. I think this is...
Yes, ask them all.
It's been such a good experience to come, but I think one that I'm thinking about after you answered my question is how, after growing up and then going to college and now doing this research, how has your views of addiction changed over the years?
I am so much more aware of the extent to which everybody enjoys substances, and many people are addicted to substances. So, like, you know, I have a lot of coffee every day, so much coffee every day, and you know, and like caffeine, you know, is a substance, and it's a substance that we're often provided at work to be more productive. Usually, like the one thing that every workplace is going to have is a coffee pot. When I was researching the origins of cocaine, when the Spanish came to South and Central America, they realized that people in these mountainous regions were chewing coca leaves for stamina. In order to, and they would, you know, just grab a handful and they would chew them periodically, almost like chewing tobacco, and that they got energy from it. And they thought of it as this devil plant. But then once they colonized and they wanted to put people to work, right, they made the leaves readily available. And in the earliest years of powder cocaine in this country, that it was very easily found in drinks and different substances, in shipyards, and any place where people did hard work. You could get drinks laced with cocaine. And then it became illegal. So okay, also the story of Coca-Cola having cocaine in it is a real thing. That's not a myth, right? That it still has trace amounts of coca leaf extract, they say for the flavor. But, you know, that's a thing. That the Atlanta race riots, which were, I think, in 1903, were instigated because, in part, of cocaine. That there were stories, right, after the substance became so popular, that it made black men in particular libidinous, that we would go all over the place raping white women. There was a story in the New York Times, Negro cocaine fiends, and it was about how, which is a term that actually stuck related to crack fiends, right? But that cocaine had the special effect in black men that made us violent in this way. It also made us better marksmen, according to this article, and impervious to bullets. So what happened was, in 1903, the Atlanta Journal and the Constitution wrote stories that a white woman had been raped in downtown Atlanta by black men. And as a result, you know, before sundown, there were mobs that had descended on downtown Atlanta, destroying the bars where these drinks were sold, these black establishments. And they worked their way down Auburn Avenue. Any of you spent any significant time in Atlanta? You know, that they, you know, worked their way down Auburn Avenue, which is sort of a black business district, into black residential neighborhoods, destroying property and killing people. So, you know, as early as 1903, cocaine has been associated with violence in black bodies in this really fascinating way. So I hope I answered your question. That was roundabout. But
So I come from Colombia, and we have our own history with cocaine during that time. And I was wondering if you could speak more to the international dynamics that were at play.
Yeah.
And if there was any relationship, and you talked about it in your book.
Yeah, I do. So I write about cocaine's origins in the book, and also I write about the cocaine conspiracy that became very popular. There was a reporter named Gary Webb who wrote for the San Jose Mercury News, and he uncovered in the early 90s a link between the CIA and the crack epidemic. And he is the reporter who discovered Freeway Ricky Ross, who was a Los Angeles drug dealer, a large sort of kingpin drug dealer. And when he interviewed Ross about the source of the tons of cocaine that he was selling, he said it was a guy named Manilo Blandón that he met sort of by happenstance when he was in he was working in an auto shop, and this guy said, "Hey, you live in South LA? You ever sold cocaine before? You ever thought about it?" So he gave him some cocaine to sell, and then he said, "Oh, by the way, I have tons of this." And Blandón was a Nicaraguan national who was very sympathetic to the Contras in Nicaragua at the time, which was a group of rebels that were attempting to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, which the United States was in support of. But the U.S. was not able to fund those efforts because Congress would not authorize a war in Nicaragua. So the Reagan administration decided to covertly and illegally ship to ship arms to these Contras in Nicaragua. That was discovered when a plane crashed full of arms. And it was an operation run by a guy named Ollie North. And there was a huge series of congressional committees about this. So a lot of people don't necessarily put this history together, but all of that was connected. When we no longer could send arms, what we allowed the Contras to do was traffic cocaine. And they were trafficking cocaine that was being processed through, who's my guy? Pablo Escobar. Pablo Escobar's operation. Oh no, he's not my guy. He is a guy. He's a guy. Through Pablo Escobar's operation in Colombia. So in this period, what you see is huge amounts of cocaine being processed in South and Central America, getting into the United States through what made Escobar really special was he was very sort of ambitious and pretty like ballsy, where he would just send plane loads of cocaine and drop them off on the coast of U.S. cities. So it wasn't traveling through Mexico, or any other means. He was just dropping off shiploads of cocaine, and then he had people in the U.S. and cities in the Gulf, on the coast of California, in places like Miami, who would then intercept these bales of cocaine, and then that was how the business operated. And he was producing so much of it that, you lose some, you lose some. So that is what was fueling that whole narco story in Colombia, and that's where the cocaine was coming from at this time that the government was not really intercepting it. And there's lots of evidence. Okay, how do I put this? What Gary Webb said is that the CIA his argument is that the CIA was actually coordinating this, right? That they were actively allowing their Contras to traffic cocaine into the United States to fund a covert war in Nicaragua. There's lots of evidence for that. There was a commission headed up by John Kerry in the early 90s that actually, linked together these CIA agents to traffickers in that part of the world. So I'm not saying that. And I'm not saying that because Gary Webb was completely discredited at the time that he did that reporting, and he committed suicide with 2 bullets to his head. So you should read Gary Webb's book, Dark Alliance, and also When Crack Was King.
Thanks. We'd actually like to offer Donovan the opportunity to read an excerpt from his book, if he's willing. I know we'd love to continue this conversation all night long. It's just a wonderful and rich conversation. But
okay, awesome. Maybe I can read the bit about Michelle. Could I borrow your book?
I know once you all hear this beautiful storytelling, you're going to also feel inspired to go out and buy the book, which is right outside the door.
Buy the book, y'all. Okay. Let's see. Yeah. So it is a long book, but I have heard that it reads well. But also, I read the audio book. if you don't mind listening to me read it. Okay. I hardly ever saw Michelle. Despite the fact that she lived just a few doors down the block from my family, I don't remember meeting her. But I learned to be afraid of her. My mom, a cautious woman who otherwise avoided gossip, would drag our house phone from room to room by its long white cord and talk at length with her friends about Michelle from down the street. Michelle had too many strange people going in and out of her house. The neighborhood could hear her parties at all hours of the night, my mom complained. She looked a mess. It was all just so sad, my mom would say with a slow shake of her head. The phone conversations would drift to other topics, but I stayed fixed on Michelle and tried to imagine what might be going on just a few feet away. One Sunday afternoon, I was sitting on our front porch with my older sister when a van pulled up and parked in front of Michelle's place. Out of it came an older woman and a young girl, each resembling our infamous neighbor in their own way. Because my sister knew everything, I asked her who the strangers were. Duh, that's Michelle's family, she said. The small girl was Michelle's daughter. Why don't she live with her mom, I asked. My sister shrugged her shoulders, dismissive, then answered, I don't know, probably because Michelle is a crackhead. It was 1993 or 1994 in Columbus, Ohio. I was just 5 or 6 years old, but I had heard the word crackhead countless times, usually from other kids. Crackhead was a go-to insult. So-and-so was acting like a crackhead. Yo mama was a crackhead. The word was popular, I assume, because it belonged to the grown-up world, and using it made us feel grown. I suppose we made it a slur because we feared what it represented, a rock bottom to which any of us could sink. That's what children do when they're in search of power over things that frighten them. We reduce them to words, bite-sized things that can be spat out at a moment's notice. Still, I couldn't make sense of the fact that Michelle was a crackhead. She lived just down the street after all, and she had a family. Crackheads were supposed to be foreigners from some netherworld, whose main activity was begging for money and otherwise disrupting community life. Then they were supposed to return to wherever they came from, alleyways, sewers, wherever the trash went after we threw it out. I remember Michelle disappearing from the neighborhood sometime soon after that visit from her family. She was replaced in my awareness by other people who lived on the margins of our poor Black community. There was the thin, light-skinned woman I'd seen sometimes around the convenience store at the end of our street. Al, the older man who owned and operated the store, called her Miss Prissy, after the skinny, frenetic chicken from the Foghorn Leghorn cartoons. There was a man whose name I never knew who walked up and down the streets always in a hurry and always selling something. Bags of loose fireworks in the summer, brand new down coats in the winter. As with Michelle, the adults I knew acknowledged him and Prissy only in passing. I did the math and concluded they were also crackheads. That type of calculus, I imagine, was common for lots of kids who grew up like me, poor and Black in the midst of the crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s. There were things happening all around us that we knew better than to ask about, things we had to figure out for ourselves. My mother had a policy, mind your business. That's exactly what she'd say when she'd catch me stealing glances at the older boys on the corner. Mind your business. It was like growing up in a steel town where nobody talked about steel. Okay. Conversations about crack became more mainstream in years to come. Our national dialogue reached its peak for me in the form of Whitney Houston, sitting down for a primetime interview to address rumors of drug use. It's a scene seared into my memory, a raspy-voiced and gaunt Houston sitting opposite Diane Sawyer. The singer is dressed entirely in white and holding a picture of herself that she's been handed by the interviewer. That's not just thin, Sawyer insists with a squint. Anorexia? Bulimia? Houston, incredulous, shakes her head. No way. Then Sawyer gets to the reason why she's really there, why we're all watching. She reads from what we're made to believe is a headline copied to a sheet of paper in her hand. Whitney dying, crack rehab fails. Houston leans in and uses a hand to punctuate the point. First of all, let's get one thing straight. Crack is cheap. I make too much money to ever smoke crack. Let's get that straight, okay? We don't do crack. We don't do that. Crack is whack. I love Whitney Houston, y'all. Sawyer continued to ask if Houston indulged in alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, or pills, and Houston admitted that she done all at times. Crack, though? Any question of the pop superstar using that substance was settled by the simple logic that Houston was too wealthy to enjoy something so low class. The singer would divulge years later in an interview with Oprah that her drug of choice had been marijuana laced with base, short for freebase. Neither she nor Oprah seemed aware that freebase and crack are different names for the exact same substance, smokable cocaine. I understand now why Houston denied it. Crack left a residue on everything it touched. Anything could be done to a person associated with the evil substance. I surveyed my community and saw its effects in the way my neighborhood was policed. It was as though the police weren't satisfied until everyone I knew had been stopped, questioned, searched, detained, fined, arrested, jailed, inconvenienced, awakened in the middle of the night, humiliated. Some would end up beaten, shot, or killed. All of us would be touched.
Thank you. As Vaughn said, Donovan's book is absolutely riveting. And it is also, as Ashlyn said, on sale out there. Was also a reception. Before you go, I'm sure a lot of us of a certain age would like to add songs to the When Crack Was King soundtrack. If I could just offer one, I said that Donovan and I grew up in the same hometown, and I was bused to a school not far away from where Donovan and Michelle grew up, although I'm a lot older than Donovan. So let me offer you an image from 1977, Franklin Junior High School, inner city Columbus, Ohio, where Dr. Horde has just finished giving the announcements to the entire school assembly, and the 20% of suburban kids like me who were bused in were gathered in a small little group, while the 80% of neighborhood kids were getting a little restless. And Dr. Horde turned the proceedings over to one of the neighborhood kids, a ninth grader, the old kid, who just said, "Hit it." And the lights went out, and every neighborhood kid who had somehow been tipped off pulled out their flashlight. And as Parliament came on at 110 decibels, the kids started waving their flashlights around and singing along and dancing in the seats. And we suburban kids were, let's say, quite startled, because we didn't know that kind of expression. Nothing like that happened in our neighborhood, but as the song went on, I at least realized that I had never seen such collective joy in a neighborhood. And if we are able to learn from history and listen to wise teachers like Donovan, we can only hope, God willing, that there'll come a time where more Americans, wherever they're from, will be able to experience that kind of joy together. So thanks to both Donovan and Vaughn for a remarkable conversation. Thank you both so very much.